My parents always favored my lawyer brother over me and my sister. We finally stood up to them at his wedding, and you won't believe what happened next. I, 28F, have two older brothers, Jake, 32M, and Mark, 30M. Our family dynamics have always been complicated, but things really came to a head last Thanksgiving. To understand why, I need to explain a bit about our childhood and how we grew up. From as early as I can remember, Jake was always the golden child in our family. He was the firstborn, and our parents seemed to think he could do no wrong. They praised his every accomplishment, no matter how small, and brushed off his mistakes as if they never happened. Jake was a natural athlete and excelled in school, which only fueled our parents' favoritism. Mark, being the middle child, often felt overlooked. He was more introverted than Jake and struggled with academics. Our parents would constantly compare him to Jake, asking why he couldn't get grades like his brother or why he wasn't interested in sports. This led to Mark developing a lot of self-esteem issues as a teenager. As for me, being the youngest and the only girl, I had a different set of challenges. Our parents had traditional views about gender roles and never fully supported my interest in art. They would make comments about how I should focus on more practical pursuits, suggesting I study business or law like Jake. Growing up, our house was always filled with trophies and awards, all belonging to Jake. His academic certificates and sports medals covered the walls, while Mark's and my achievements were barely acknowledged. I remember one time in high school when I won a local art competition. I was so excited to tell my parents, but when I got home, they were busy celebrating Jake making the honor roll again. My news was met with a distracted "that's nice, honey," and then forgotten. This pattern continued into our adult lives. Jake went on to law school and became a successful corporate lawyer. Our parents couldn't stop bragging about him to anyone who would listen. Meanwhile, Mark struggled to find his path. He bounced between various jobs, never seeming to find his niche. Our parents would make not-so-subtle comments about how he should be more ambitious like Jake. I pursued my passion for art, much to our parents' disappointment. They would often ask when I was going to get a real job or suggest I go back to school for something more practical. It was frustrating because I was actually doing quite well as a freelance illustrator, but they never seemed to see my work as a legitimate career. The tension between us siblings grew over the years. Jake, basking in our parents' constant praise, became increasingly arrogant. He would make condescending remarks about Mark's job struggles or my little art projects. Mark became more withdrawn and resentful, while I found myself constantly defending my choices to my family. Last year, Jake bought a big house in an upscale neighborhood. Our parents were overjoyed and suggested he host Thanksgiving there to show it off to the extended family. Jake agreed, clearly eager to impress everyone. In the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, Mark and I both offered to help with the preparations. We thought it might be a good opportunity to bond as siblings and take some of the stress off Jake. But Jake insisted on doing everything himself, saying he wanted it to be perfect. When Thanksgiving Day arrived, Mark and I showed up early to see if we could help with anything. Jake answered the door looking frazzled and stressed. He barely greeted us before rushing back to the kitchen, where something was burning. As more family members arrived, Jake's mood worsened. He snapped at our cousin for sitting on a new couch and yelled at our uncle for bringing the wrong type of wine. Mark and I exchanged worried glances, knowing this wasn't going to end well. During dinner, Jake started bragging about a big case he had just won. Our parents were fawning over him as usual, asking for every detail and praising his legal brilliance. The rest of us could barely get a word in edgewise. At one point, Mark tried to share some good news. He had a promising job interview lined up with a nonprofit organization he was really excited about. But before he could finish explaining, our mom cut him off to ask Jake more questions about his case. I saw the hurt look on Mark's face, and something in me snapped. I told Jake to shut up about work for 5 minutes so the rest of us could talk too. The table went silent. Jake looked at me in shock, then his face hardened. He said it wasn't his fault that Mark and I didn't have any real accomplishments to share. Our parents immediately jumped to Jake's defense, scolding me for being rude to my successful brother. Mark stood up for me, telling our parents they always favored Jake and it wasn't fair. He brought up all the times they had dismissed his efforts or belittled his interests. I joined in, finally voicing years of pent-up frustration about their lack of support for my art career. Things quickly devolved into a huge argument. Jake accused us of being jealous of his success. Our parents said we were being ungrateful and should appreciate having such an accomplished brother. Aunts, uncles, and cousins watched in awkward silence as years of family tension exploded at the dinner table. Finally, Jake had enough. He stood up and told us all to get out of his house. Mark and I left together, while our parents stayed behind to comfort Jake. As we drove away, I felt a mix of relief at finally speaking my mind and anxiety about what this meant for our family. In the days that followed, Jake refused to speak to Mark or me. Our parents kept calling and texting, pressuring us to apologize. They said we had ruined Thanksgiving and embarrassed them in front of the whole family. But Mark and I stood our ground. We were tired of always having to cater to Jake's ego and our parents' expectations. Weeks turned into months with no contact between us siblings. Our parents would give us updates on Jake's life during our weekly calls, but we didn't really care. They seemed incapable of understanding our perspective, always steering the conversation back to how we needed to make things right with Jake. During this time, Mark and I became closer than ever. We started having regular sibling dinners, supporting each other in a way we never had before. It was nice to finally have a family relationship that felt equal and supportive. I threw myself into my art, finally feeling free to pursue it without constant criticism. I landed a big project illustrating a children's book series, which kept me busy and fulfilled. Mark continued his job search, eventually finding a great position at the nonprofit he had interviewed with. We were both happier than we'd been in years, building our own chosen family of friends and supportive colleagues. As the months went by, we heard through family grapevine that Jake was struggling at work. Apparently, the stress of always needing to be perfect was getting to him. Part of me felt a twinge of sympathy, remembering the pressure our parents had always put on him. But a bigger part of me felt like he was finally experiencing some of the struggle Mark and I had dealt with for years. Update 1: It's been about 8 months since the Thanksgiving blow-up, and a lot has changed in that time. Mark and I have barely spoken to our parents, just occasional terse phone calls. We declined their invitations for Christmas, New Year's, and other family events. It was hard at first, especially around the holidays, but we found our own ways to celebrate and create new traditions. Jake got engaged to his longtime girlfriend Sarah, 31F, a few months ago. Sarah had been around for years, but we never got to know her well because Jake always kept her separate from family drama. Our parents were thrilled about the engagement, of course. Mom called me right away to gush about wedding plans and how excited she was to have Sarah officially join the family. During that call, Mom started pushing Mark and me to reconcile with Jake before the wedding. She painted this picture of a perfect family reunion, glossing over all the hurt and resentment of the past years. I told her it wasn't that simple, but she didn't seem to hear me. Dad got on the phone too, saying we needed to grow up and put the past behind us for Jake's sake. It was the same old pattern. Jake's feelings and experiences were the only ones that mattered. Mark and I talked about it afterward. We both felt frustrated by our parents' pressure but agreed that we didn't want to cause drama around Jake's wedding. We decided to send a polite congratulations card to Jake and Sarah but maintain our distance otherwise. So you can imagine my shock when I received a formal wedding invitation from Jake last week. I immediately called Mark, who had gotten one too. We were both confused since we hadn't spoken to Jake in months. Part of me wondered if it was some kind of trick or if our parents had pressured him into inviting us. After debating it for a day, I decided to call Jake directly to figure out what was going on. I was nervous as the phone rang, half expecting him to ignore the call. But he actually picked up, which surprised me. Jake explained that Sarah had convinced him to invite us. Apparently she felt bad about the family rift and wanted everyone there for their big day. Jake didn't exactly apologize for Thanksgiving, but he did say he regretted how things went down. He admitted he had been really stressed about work and took it out on us unfairly. It wasn't a full admission of his years of arrogant behavior or the way he had treated us, but it was something. More than we'd ever gotten from him before. Jake said he missed having us in his life and hoped we could start to mend things. I told Jake I'd think about attending and talk it over with Mark. After we hung up, I had really mixed feelings. Part of me wanted to repair our relationship. Despite everything, Jake was still my brother and I did miss the good times we'd had growing up. But another part was wary of falling back into old dynamics. I didn't want to pretend everything was fine if nothing had really changed. I met up with Mark to discuss it over coffee. He was even more skeptical than me about Jake's olive branch. Mark pointed out that Jake still hadn't really acknowledged the root of our issues, the years of favoritism and put-downs. He was worried that if we went to the wedding, our parents would act like everything was fixed and expect us to go back to the way things were. We debated back and forth for hours. Mark brought up all the times Jake had belittled his career struggles. I remembered the cutting remarks about my art being a hobby. But we also talked about good memories, family vacations when we were kids, inside jokes only the three of us shared. In the end, we decided to attend the wedding, but with clear boundaries. We would be civil to Jake and our parents, but not pretend everything was fine. And we wouldn't tolerate any more manipulative behavior or guilt trips. We agreed to stick together and leave if things got uncomfortable. I called Jake back to RSVP, making it clear that this wasn't a full reconciliation yet. I explained that we were willing to take a small step toward repairing our relationship, but it would take time and effort on everyone's part. Jake seemed to understand and said he looked forward to seeing us there. After I hung up, I felt a mix of hope and anxiety. I wanted to believe Jake had changed, that we could rebuild our sibling bond. But I was also bracing myself for disappointment. I knew our parents would probably try to push for more than we were ready to give. Mark and I spent the next few weeks preparing ourselves mentally and emotionally for the wedding. We role-played different scenarios, coming up with strategies to maintain our boundaries. We also focused on self-care, knowing it would be a stressful event. I threw myself into a new art project, while Mark started volunteering at a local community center. As the wedding day approached, I found myself feeling nostalgic. I dug out old family photos, remembering happier times before the tension and resentment set in. There was one of the three of us at the beach, building a giant sandcastle together. Another from Jake's high school graduation, where he was hugging Mark and me tightly. I hoped we could find our way back to being that close again, but I knew it wouldn't be easy. The night before the wedding, Mark came over to my place. We stayed up late talking, psyching ourselves up for the next day. We promised to have each other's backs no matter what happened. As I went to bed, I felt a mix of nervousness and cautious optimism about what the wedding would bring. Update 2: the wedding was last weekend and it was interesting to say the least. Mark and I decided to go together for moral support. We got ready at my place, both feeling a bit anxious. I almost changed my mind at the last minute, but Mark encouraged me to follow through. We arrived at the ceremony venue and took seats near the back, trying to avoid drama. I felt tense, scanning the room for our parents and Jake. The church looked beautiful, decorated with white flowers and soft lights. Our parents spotted us right away, of course. Mom rushed over, gushing about how happy she was that we came. She tried to hug me, but I stepped back, keeping things to a polite handshake. Dad gave us each an awkward side hug. We kept things cordial but distant, making it clear we weren't here for a big family reunion. The ceremony itself was actually quite nice. Jake looked happier and more relaxed than I'd seen him in years. When Sarah walked down the aisle, his face lit up. Jake actually got choked up during his vows, which really surprised me. I'd never seen him show that much emotion before. Sarah seemed really sweet and genuinely in love with Jake. Her vows talked about how Jake had become a better person since they'd been together, learning to be more patient and understanding. It made me wonder how much she knew about our family issues and if she had really been the one to push for this reconciliation attempt. At the reception, Mark and I mostly stuck to ourselves at first. We found a table at the back of the room, happy to fly under the radar. A few relatives stopped by to say hello, some making awkward comments about how nice it was to see us there. We deflected as politely as we could, not wanting to get into family drama. We ended up chatting with some of Jake's friends we knew from childhood. It was actually kind of nice to catch up with them and reminisce about old times. They seemed to sense the tension and didn't bring up any of the recent family issues, which I appreciated. I was in the middle of a conversation about my latest art project when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I turned to see Jake standing there, looking a bit nervous. He thanked us sincerely for coming, saying it meant a lot to him and Sarah. We had a surprisingly pleasant conversation, mostly about neutral topics like his honeymoon plans. Jake seemed different, more relaxed and less arrogant than usual. As the night went on, I started to relax a bit. The food was good, the music was fun, and it was nice to see Jake so happy. Mark and I even hit the dance floor for a few songs, letting loose for the first time all night. Later in the evening, Jake pulled me aside for a private talk. I was wary at first, but his tone was sincere. He apologized for real this time, acknowledging how his behavior and our parents' favoritism had hurt Mark and me over the years. Jake admitted that therapy, suggested by Sarah, had opened his eyes to a lot of issues in our family dynamic. Jake talked about how he'd always felt immense pressure to be perfect, to live up to our parents' expectations. He said he now realized how unfair it was that Mark and I didn't get the same support and encouragement. Jake even brought up specific incidents from our childhood, times when he'd put us down or dismissed our achievements. It was clear he'd done a lot of reflection on our family history. I was honestly shocked. I never thought I'd hear Jake take responsibility like that. Part of me was skeptical, wondering if this was just a show for his wedding day. But the look in his eyes seemed genuinely remorseful. I told Jake I appreciated his apology and was open to working on our relationship slowly. I made it clear that it would take time to rebuild trust, but I was willing to try if he was serious about changing. We hugged for the first time in years, and I felt a glimmer of hope that maybe we could be real siblings again. When I told Mark about the conversation, he was cautiously optimistic. He wanted to believe Jake had changed but was wary of getting hurt again. We agreed to take things one step at a time, remaining open to rebuilding our relationship with Jake but keeping our guard up. As for our parents, they seemed oblivious to the deeper issues at play. They kept trying to push for picture-perfect family moments, which we gently but firmly refused. That's a battle for another day, but at least Jake seemed to be on our side now. The wedding ended on a hopeful note. As Mark and I drove home, we dissected every interaction, trying to figure out if this new Jake was for real. We were both tentatively excited about the possibility of having our brother back in our lives, but also realistic about the long road ahead. Update 3. It's been about 6 months since Jake's wedding. Our relationship has improved slowly but steadily. We've had a few family dinners that went surprisingly well. Jake seems committed to changing his behavior, and Sarah has been a positive influence. After the wedding, Jake reached out to suggest we start having regular sibling get-togethers. We started with short coffee meetings, gradually working up to longer dinners and outings. It was awkward at first, with long silences and careful small talk. But over time, we've started to relax around each other again. Jake has made a real effort to show interest in our lives. He asks thoughtful questions about my art projects and offers to introduce me to potential clients. With Mark, he's been supportive of his nonprofit work, even volunteering at a few events. It's a big change from the dismissive attitude he used to have. Mark is still more guarded than me, but even he admits Jake is making an effort. We've started having brother-sister outings once a month to rebuild our bond. Last month, we went hiking together, something we used to do as kids. It was nice to see glimpses of our old dynamic, joking around and enjoying each other's company without the usual tension. The bigger challenge has been our parents. They still struggle to treat us equally and often make tone-deaf comments. At a recent family dinner, Mom praised Jake for getting a big promotion at work, then immediately asked me when I was going to get a stable job instead of freelancing. It was like she hadn't heard anything we'd said over the past months. The difference now is that Jake has started calling them out on it. When Mom made that comment about my job, Jake jumped in to talk about how successful my recent art show had been. He's been doing the same for Mark, highlighting his achievements at the nonprofit. It's caused some tension with our parents, who don't seem to know how to react to Jake standing up to them. But I'm glad he's finally on our side. Last week, we all sat down for a serious family meeting. Jake had suggested it, feeling like we needed to address the underlying issues in our family dynamic. Years of resentment and hurt feelings came pouring out. There were raised voices and tears, but also moments of real understanding. I talked about how it felt to have my art constantly dismissed as a hobby. Mark opened up about the pressure he felt to live up to Jake's example and how it had affected his self-esteem. Jake admitted to the guilt he felt for not standing up for us sooner, and therapy had helped him recognize his own role in the family problems. Our parents were defensive at first, insisting they had always treated us equally. But as we all shared specific memories and incidents, they started to see the pattern. Mom broke down crying, saying she never meant to make Mark and me feel less valued. Dad was quieter, but he eventually acknowledged that they had put too much pressure on Jake and not enough faith in Mark and me. It was an emotionally exhausting conversation, but it felt like a breakthrough. For the first time, our parents seemed to really grasp how their favoritism had damaged us all. They apologized for not supporting Mark and me more in our chosen paths. They also recognized how their expectations had put an unfair burden on Jake. We've agreed to try family therapy to work through our issues. I'm cautiously hopeful that we can build healthier relationships moving forward. It's going to take time and effort from all of us, but at least now we're all acknowledging the problems and committing to change. I've realized that while Jake's behavior was problematic, our parents' favoritism was the real root of our issues. I'm proud of how Mark and I have grown and stood up for ourselves. We've become much closer through all of this, and I know we'll always have each other's backs. Jake has shown real growth too. He's more humble now, more willing to listen and admit when he's wrong. Sarah has been great through all of this, encouraging Jake to work on our relationship and being welcoming to Mark and me. As for our parents, they're trying. They've started making more of an effort to show interest in my art and Mark's work. Mom even came to my latest gallery opening, and she seemed genuinely impressed. They still slip into old habits sometimes, but they're more open to being called out on it now. We're taking things day by day, working on rebuilding trust and creating a more balanced family dynamic. It's not always easy, and there are still moments of frustration and hurt feelings. But overall, I feel more optimistic about our family's future than I have in years. Whatever happens, I'm grateful for the stronger bond I've developed with Mark through all of this. And I'm cautiously excited about the possibility of having a real relationship with Jake again. It's a work in progress, but we're all committed to making it work.